Well, good evening. Good evening and welcome to a wonderful evening ahead with Jamie Pope, who is an adjunct assistant professor of nutritional sciences at Vanderbilt. And Jamie is a registered dietitian. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and she is an amazing expert on so many vital topics that apply to us as nurses. And I'm Dr. Hannah Lowe. I'll be doing the moderating this evening. And I have had the pleasure of working with Jamie as a teaching associate when I attended Vanderbilt. I came to Vanderbilt as a dietitian, graduated with my FNP, and currently practice. So a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Jamie. One is we know that this topic is incredibly expansive. So tonight is part one, where we'll review this amazing material. You'll be provided the PowerPoint as well. So this will be great for references. And we also want to acknowledge that we know people will have questions, and we will take those in part for part two. And I've already been grateful for questions that were posed even prior to the discussion. And finally, happy Nurses Month. It's wonderful to celebrate with you and with our expert, Jamie, with us. And the next discussion around nutrition will start at 6 p.m. on June 15th. So we'll all gather again, hopefully in a month. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Jamie as our guest and expert.
Thank you, Hannah. Hannah, can you just give me a thumbs up that you can see the first slide? Okay. Well, welcome everybody. This is exciting. I have been at Vanderbilt since 1986 and have been with School of Nursing since 2000, teaching primarily undergraduate intro nutrition. So thank you, Hannah, for that introduction and for some of the groundwork that we'll be doing tonight. And it's exciting for me to also team with Hannah after working with her and knowing her. So let's get started because we do have lots to talk about tonight, and I am excited that we're going to do a part two because this topic could truly be a whole semester course or more, but we're going to hit some highlights tonight and then come back and address some of the questions that you've already submitted. So just a little bit of an overview. We're going to talk a little bit tonight. Some of this may be review for you or maybe a refresher. A little bit about the DRIs, the dietary reference intakes, some of the highlights and takeaways from the newest edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans and how those might apply to practice. A little bit about dietary supplements, how that industry is regulated, some of the things you should think about, and then some of the resources that I would highly recommend as something to keep at your fingertips. We will also talk, hopefully, a little bit about nutrition information and resources and how you can evaluate things in the media that you read, that you hear, that your patients may come in and ask about. And then as time permits, a little bit on popular weight loss diets and programs. And if we don't get to that, that is something that we'll address in part two because a lot of the questions reflected content on some of those. And as Hannah mentioned, we have already added a part two just based on interest and the volume of questions that we received. So nutrition is an exciting field. It's also an evolving field. It's one that for many people is as much a belief system as it is a science, that you come up against individuals who have very strong perspectives on nutrition. And as a nutrition professional, it's something I have to gauge in terms of how to interact sometimes, how to deal with some of those things and some of the absolutes that people believe about nutrition. So we're interested in some of the questions you get from patients and also some of the questions you might have personally. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on a lot of these slides. You will get a copy. It's just more kind of talk over and to jump on. But every semester for the years I've been teaching, which is many now, and over 7,000 undergrads since the beginning, I would ask them to submit one diet or nutrition related question they'd like addressed during the semester. And I would use those questions kind of to help guide certain lectures and content. And they were trending based on what was out there. Several of you asked about keto, which was not even on the horizon 10 years ago. So, you just see different questions, but a lot ask about what is a healthy diet? And I'm like, okay, we got a whole semester to answer that question. That it's not a question that you can easily answer. And also to say that one thing I always share is that I address questions. I don't necessarily always answer them because nutrition is evolving. New information is coming out all the time. So while I can address questions, I can't always give definitive answers because things are evolving. These are some of the questions that you all submitted, and just a sampling of those on plant-based diets, which we will definitely address some of the evidence, which is really strong, I'll tell you that, in terms of plant-based diets for longevity, for disease prevention, for all kinds of variables, supplements, we're going to touch on that some. Gut health is an area certainly of interest. And just, here's intermittent fasting, here's keto. Some of these we will address within the context of tonight, but a lot we will have to kind of wait on, or hopefully some you will be able to address with some of the resources that we provide. So every year, the International Food and Information Council puts out a food and health survey where it looks at oftentimes behaviors, perspectives, and beliefs about nutrition and diet in the American public. And I always find it interesting that people have a hard time. My students ask, what's a healthy diet? Well, when you poll the Americans in this survey, you see that people believe it's easier to do their taxes. And we just finished those up recently than it is to figure out what a healthy diet is. And a lot of the reason for that is we are bombarded with information, oftentimes conflicting. We hear things not only through the media, but from family, from friends, and even from our health professionals. And sometimes it's hard to interpret that information, filter what's maybe fact from possible fiction, and apply that to your life. We don't do that great as a population in terms of actually adhering to the principles that might constitute a healthy diet. This is based on the Healthy Eating Index with a score of 100 being like the highest, which I tell my students, you don't want to be 100. You'd be pretty boring. Nobody'd want to hang out with you, but we don't get very close to that. And you can see how it changes across life stages here. With some of the healthier eaters, quote, being some of the older age groups, and the higher scores too when parents have more control here in these earlier, or caregivers do, and kind of dropping, not surprisingly, through some of the teen years. And what's interesting too, when you look at how we eat as Americans, we tend to overconsume the very things that we're told to eat less of, and underconsume the very things that we're told to consume more of. So, suboptimal fiber intake, higher saturated fat, higher added sugar, higher sodium, and lower amounts of vegetables and fruits and fiber, as I mentioned. So it's a tough one. It's tough. And all these things will contribute, when you look at it, in terms of disease risk, in terms of increasing disease risk potentially, and potentially lowering disease risk. So we know that consumption of more plant-based foods, more vegetables, more fruits, more whole grains, legumes, beans, tends to actually lower disease risk in many areas. Whereas overconsumption of, say, saturated fat, some of the other things that we might overconsume would actually increase our risk. So when you look at that, the quantity of these things, the variety of our diet overall, applies and affects ultimate disease risk. So how do we know how much to consume of things? How do we know what these levels are that we consume? And that is based on oftentimes the dietary reference intakes that have been established decades ago and added to, modified as research comes out by the National Academy of Sciences. And these dietary reference intakes are designed to meet the nutrient needs of most all healthy people. They are designed to not only optimize our health, but also designed to prevent disease, chronic disease. And they also include a way of what's the highest level of a nutrient above which you may have adverse effects. So they're multidimensional. You can kind of think of them as an umbrella, that the DRIs themselves have different values within them. So I've provided for you here a couple of links. And I'm going to go ahead and open one just because it's very interesting to look at. Skip your application. And here we go. Let me share this. So this is a DRI calculator that's included here on the slide. You probably could just Google DRI calculator and find it that way. So you put in certain variables for individuals, and I won't take the time to do that, but it will tell you the recommended intake for vitamins and minerals and such, carbohydrates, protein, based on height, weight, age, different variables. So this is a valuable resource for people. I think I got rid of my slides. Let me share again, sorry. So hopefully that is something that you can put to use. However, it's just numbers, it's numbers. How do you apply numbers to actual food choice? So that is one of the challenges of DRIs, but that's also one of the intentions, as we'll see in a minute. This is the DRIs, there's 5 values included with them. The RDA, which we all hear about oftentimes, adequate intake, those are for nutrients for which there's not adequate evidence and information to be able to establish a specific RDA, EAR, which estimates the likelihood. Tolerable upper limit has been getting more interest. This is the level above which adverse effects have been demonstrated. You rarely can even get near the UL without supplements. That just food choice alone is almost impossible for most nutrients to even get close to the UL. So patients that may be eating certain nutrients, supplementing with those nutrients, buying foods that are fortified with those nutrients could potentially get close to the UL. We are still learning what are some of the signs and symptoms that might be related to some of these adverse effects. For example, the UL for vitamin C is 2,000 IUs, whereas the RDA is around 75 for women, 90 for men. So it's about 20 times the RDA, but it's still possible if people are heavily supplementing over time, that they could potentially see more GI upset, some of those kind of issues. And so clinicians may need to be more in tune to some of this with supplement use so abundant. The CDRR, the chronic disease risk reduction, is a brand new variable within or value within the DRIs. It's only been added in the last couple of years. And right now it exists for sodium and potassium. So it's above at which, or the level that we can relate to disease reduction and risk of disease. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is from my textbook, just one of the charts that kind of explains the definitions, and these will be in your slides, of what these variables are and how they play into planning a diet with the DRIs. So you've probably talked about DRIs in a nutrition class or learned them, but they're important numbers. They're important for health professionals to have access to in terms of what is recommended intake, what's too much, and those kind of things. We know that a safe intake is likely between the RDA, which the RDA represents the minimum amount that you need to maintain health and prevent disease. That's the minimum. The UL is the maximum above which you would have potential adverse effects. ULs have not been established for all nutrients, but a safe range of intake is between those two. The point being, you don't have to eat a specific number. that it's actually a range above that RDA, less than the UL. So within that range is considered safe for people to not go below the RDA and not above the UL. And for some nutrients, it's a pretty broad range. For others, it's a little more narrow. So it just depends on which nutrient it is. So the way that the DRIs are translated can be through the dietary recommendations. So these are more food-based recommendations rather than specific numbers, although certainly they will include those numbers. So these come out every 5 years. They come out from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and from USDA. A joint effort between these. They are formed from an expert committee. The 2025 edition, the panel has already convened. They're asking for public comment now, professional comment from associations like the Dietetic Association to plan into the next edition. So they look at the body of evidence, whether any new revisions need to be made on the last edition to put out the new edition. These are designed primarily for health professionals, not for the public, even though they can be used for the public, but they really are to guide health professionals in translating dietary information. So they provide information on what to eat, about meeting your nutrient needs. And for the first time, the dietary guidelines for the 2020-2025 edition are broken down by stage of life. That's the first time. And for the first time, they include infancy to age 2. The dietary guidelines predated 2020, started at age 2. So now they're recommendations for infancy. And again, they are designed more. So you have the recommendation here, and it's just dietary guidelines for Americans. This is the table of contents for the newest edition, and you can see there's various chapters based on lifespan. I just finished teaching a 6-part series called The Role of Diet, Nutrition, and Healthy Aging. And I learned a lot, but I also included certainly this chapter 6 and some of the recommendations that had very specific in terms of how supplementation, for example, in this age group may differ from other age groups. So this is a great resource, just dietaryguidelines.gov. And you can download the PDF, of course, all free, and use specific chapters that may have information for you, but also may have information for some of your patients that may have more specific questions and that you feel it would be appropriate to refer. For this edition, there's 4 overarching guidelines. They're kind of common sense. Follow a healthy eating pattern, customize, enjoy nutrient-dense foods. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Focus on meeting your food groups, and then limit foods and beverages higher in added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium, and limit alcoholic beverages. One of the controversies about this edition of the guidelines was that the expert committee recommended a lower level of added sugar than actually came out in the guidelines. The expert committee also recommended reducing alcohol, that currently what's considered moderate is 1 drink a day for women, 2 for men. The expert committee said it should be 1 for both men and women. So they did not incorporate that in the 2020. They didn't feel there was sufficient evidence to make a quantitative change, but we may see that in the 2025. It is more plant forward than previous editions, but falls short of actually recommending to restrict or modify intake of red meat, which is something else that we may see in the future. But that's kind of where sometimes we may see lobbying and such come into play. But if you look at the actual guidelines themselves, the wording is truly pretty plant forward. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Again, you can look up this resource on each of these overarching guidelines, but I want to make a point here. This is what a healthy diet is, or what a healthy diet should achieve. A healthy diet should meet people's nutrient needs, should meet their vitamin, their mineral, their macronutrient needs, their fiber needs. It should also help people achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. And that's a whole nother discussion, but just that's conducive to a healthy body weight. A healthy diet would also be one that helped reduce risk of chronic disease. And I add a fourth one. A healthy diet should be one we enjoy. A healthy diet should be one that fosters the joy of eating. So not just so focused, so prescriptive, but also enjoyment and joy of food and all that revolves around food and community. So again, I won't read through this, and this touches on some of the things that I already mentioned about added sugar and alcohol. And this was the response to some of that controversy in terms of why they didn't make that change at this time. The guidelines also, it's important to know, build on the previous guidelines. So they don't negate what was in the previous edition. They build on it and add to it and often kind of reconfigure how they're presented, but they build upon those recommendations. So the second one is about nutrient density, and that a healthy dietary pattern is helpful for everybody. And the third one is focusing on meeting your food group needs with an emphasis on nutrient-dense foods. Nutrient-dense foods are foods that provide a higher amount of nutrients for the number of calories they provide. So they are, more bang for your buck, so to speak. They're foods that give you more nutrition for the number of calories that might be in that food. And also, that doesn't exceed recommended levels too. This is new in the newest edition, where they actually gave a breakdown of what they were recommending in terms of percentages. I've always said I live by the 80-20 rule, that 80% of the time I choose nutrient-dense, healthy, way of eating, and I give myself 20% elbow room. The guidelines this time kind of make that a little more stringent with 85-15, saying that in order for us to meet our needs, we need to be making more nutrient-dense, varied selections 85% of the time. The 15% would represent added sugar, saturated fats, alcohol, things that aren't so nutrient-dense, but that there can be a place for it. People that are more active, that expend more calories, even based on just being larger, or certainly expending calories through activity, are going to have a little more elbow room in terms of how much that 15% represents. With my college kids, my football players sometimes had almost 1,000 calories in, quote, discretionary calories, because they could meet their nutrient needs, but their needs were 3,000 and more calories. Some of my females that may have been sedentary and small only had maybe 150 calories to play with, because they needed the bulk of their calories just to meet their needs. So it's kind of an interesting concept. But again, it's that 85-15 that was recommended. And this is just showing how you can take foods that are inherently nutrient dense and make them more energy dense by adding more fat or frying or, adding sugar to things that are inherently nutrient dense foods. So, just here's this full fat mocha, the espresso and fat-free milk here is in the blue, but when you add more high fat milk and chocolate syrup and sugar, all of a sudden the calories go up, the nutrient density will fall, and the energy density would go up. So all those kind of things. What increases energy density in foods, which is the number of calories per given volume of a food, are fat, sugar, and alcohol. The things that decrease energy density in food are water and fiber. So, when you look at what a food contains, it's going to alter not only the nutrient density, but the energy density as well. So this is just an example of energy density. If you look at, say, a taco shell, which is fried, versus a corn tortilla, which is not fried, or a flour tortilla even that's unfried, you can see the energy density drops. And you can see like fresh strawberries are only 0.3. So you can eat a bunch for not a lot of calories. But if you buy the frozen sweetened strawberries, the energy density is higher. So energy density is kind of based on the concept that you can eat more if you choose foods with low energy density. And that if you have a lot of foods with high energy density, the volume you can consume is less. So some of the more successful dietary approaches are actually based on this energy density concept, allowing people to eat more volume with fewer calories. And this just again illustrates some of the concepts around energy density. So the meal here on the right is almost 1,600 calories for this day of food, which is still pretty low, whereas the one on the left is also the same number of calories. So you can see the variability in the volume and the number of bites, I like to say, when you emphasize more lower energy density foods. And I think for many patients and individuals, that, helping them learn how to eat more for fewer calories to help with weight management. And also you can just see the nutritional differences potentially between these two approaches. This is a study looking at energy density and weight management that demonstrated that clinical trials show that reducing energy density is effective for weight loss and weight loss maintenance. So that approach is important, as we'll maybe touch on today if we don't run out of time, and definitely next time. There's several plans that use this as their fundamental, and it's not necessarily that I'm recommending them. I've had a couple of friends do Noom, and if you look at what they're being told, it's really to choose less energy dense foods. Weight Watchers uses that plan. There's several programs out there that kind of use that fundamental. There's the popular diet book called Volumetrics that uses that plan as well. So this is also a chart from that study that I think is super valuable, where it looks at some of these principles, breaking down how much fat, how much protein, how much carb, fiber, added sugar, beverages, and the strategies of monitoring portions, and again, increasing the proportion of lower energy dense foods you consume and reducing the amount of energy dense foods you consume. So this is something you'll have access to. It's also in that link to the research study. But I think this is just a super valuable kind of outline of what the variables are and the factors in a healthy approach that doesn't restrict food groups, just kind of guide you towards different changes and choices within those groups. The fourth guideline or overarching guideline in the dietary guidelines is again, watching out for added sugar, saturated fat, and alcoholic beverages. It doesn't mean elimination. It doesn't mean avoidance. I cringe when I see recommendations or people say avoid. I don't think we have to avoid much of anything. And that avoid, I think oftentimes sets people up because then if they have some, that we don't have to avoid everything. You don't have to avoid saturated fat. You don't have to avoid added sugars. It's more relative to the rest of your diet. The guidelines recommend less than 10% of total calories coming from added sugar, and to avoid it altogether under age 2. Right now, as Americans, we consume 13% or more higher in certain age groups, but less than 10% is actually a pretty ambitious goal. The World Health Organization recommends less than 5%, but you also have to think about what's realistic. And what happens is when you consume more than 10%, it starts altering the nutrient quality of your diet, that you're displacing more nutrient dense foods, and you're also potentially adding additional calories. But, some added sugar not only makes the diet more palatable and sustainable, but it does not necessarily alter the risk as long as it's a modest intake. So less than 10% saturated fat, again, less than 10%. You might see some modification on that for people that have lipid abnormalities, might drop to 7%, but in general, less than 10%. And of course, sodium, less than 2,300 milligrams, which is the CDRR. And alcoholic beverages I've mentioned, that currently it's consumed less than 2 drinks a day or 1 drink a day for women. And a drink is, a beer, 5 ounces of wine, a shot or 1.5 ounces of 80 proof liquor, that those are considered what's equivalent to a drink. So just a couple of other things. We talked about added sugars a little bit. And when you look at that 85-15 that we already discussed, that in reality, if you apply that, it definitely is under 10% from added sugar, because some's going to be coming from saturated fat as well. And we get most of our sugars from sugar sweetened beverages, sodas, sweetened, even energy drinks. Those kind of things are a big contributor. Also some desserts and sweet snacks, but just even modifying sweetened beverages can make a huge dent in added sugar consumption. Saturated fat, less than 10%. Most of our saturated fat, surprisingly, comes from sandwiches, burgers, meats, processed meats, luncheon meats, those kind of things. And then also casserole dishes and such. Not as much from added fat as we might think, but more so inherent in some of our typical food choices in the US. Another important takeaway is that, and I'm sure you learned this in nutrition, that all foods, all fats are a combination of monos, polys, saturated. So no food is completely saturated. No food is completely mono, or no food is completely poly. That you're going to see these blends that are inherent in many of these fats. So, you can see here that walnuts are pretty high in polyunsaturates. Your oils are going to vary in terms of the saturated fat and such. But the point is that it's not all or nothing, that all fats are blends, and it's just emphasizing some of the ones that are higher in the polys and the monos over the ones that are higher in the saturated fats. And when we reduce saturated fat and replace it with polyunsaturated fat, you see a dramatic reduction in heart disease risk. When you reduce fat and replace it with simple carb, you actually see an increase. And so, it's not necessarily cutting out fat, it's eating healthier fats, and replacing the less healthy fats with healthier fats is where you see the disease benefit. Or you can also replace some of that with more quality carbohydrates. But again, replacing fat with simple carbs actually can elevate risk. And the principles, again, I'll let you kind of read the dietary guidelines if you're interested. But again, meeting our needs primarily from food instead of supplements by eating a wide variety, by eating across the food groups, and eating adequate amounts too. And, options within the groups, not just apples, but a variety of fruits, and paying attention to portion sizes. And these, when you look at the dietary guidelines, they provide healthy eating patterns. They have the typical, quote, American one that kind of is aligned with how Americans typically eat, but they also have a Mediterranean and a vegetarian pattern within the dietary guidelines. And this is where you can get resources, free resources, handouts, all kinds of stuff for you or for your patients with just dietaryguidelines.gov. And somebody asked about My Plate. My Plate is kind of the public forward. It it is the icon or the visualization of the dietary guidelines. So it's supposed to take the dietary guidelines and put them into the public arena. And, you know, we're all familiar with this. The new My Plate incorporates soy or fortified milk alternatives instead of just dairy and some other alternatives, more emphasis on other protein sources than just like animal sources. But again, this, if you go to the website, it's set up with resources by life stage, which is new. And I just want to show you this because I love this. And to reinforce that what we are telling the public, because sometimes people are just almost inherently suspicious of things that are coming from the government. Even though these are evidence-based, expert committee formed, and I think provide a great basis, we're not alone in recommending the things we recommend in terms of a plant-forward diet, in terms of modification of sodium, added sugar, saturated fat. It's universal. And around the world, there are dietary guidelines for over 100 countries. And it's fascinating. This is one of the assignments I give in my undergrad class. And let me just show you guys this really quick, because it's fun to look at. But if you see, all these countries have dietary guidelines, and they all have icons too. For example, if you look at Ecuador here, some of their recommendations, I love their, instead of our boring My Plate, that is their visual representation of a healthy diet. But again, it doesn't contradict. It is just a little different. And some of their recommendations would be a little different than ours. Let's eat healthy and tasty. And so some countries put emphasis on breastfeeding. Some countries put emphasis on balancing intake and expenditure. So, but inherently, they're all communicating very similar messages, just sometimes very culturally specific.
That's amazing, Jamie. I'm just thinking about from a primary care resource standpoint too, like sometimes when we work with refugees and various groups trying to meet their needs. So that's an amazing referral, and look forward to using that resource personally.
It's a fun resource. And it's one fun to explore and read them, and just even the wording. I'm always impressed by how many of the guidelines do incorporate enjoyment and sharing of family time and with friends around food, whereas we don't necessarily incorporate that. So it's kind of cool. So I know we're covering a lot here, and hopefully some of this is helpful or at least a refresher for you. But supplements, tons of questions on supplements, not only from you, but from the public. Huge industry, and only growing. The newer statistics are that more than 80% of Americans are using some type of dietary supplement, and fewer than 25% do so at the recommendation of a health professional. So they're making these choices themselves, or on, you know, the recommendation of family or friends, or what they read, what they hear. And so, you know, it's truly a consumer beware industry. There's not the kind of regulation. This is one of the newer stats for 2021. You can see that we have the highest level of supplement use that we've ever seen. A lot of that's related to COVID and people hoping to stay well, to, you know, support their immunity, reading more about supplements and turning to supplements to hopefully not only prevent, but potentially, you know, treat some of the COVID related things. So the point from this one is, if you look at middle-aged and older adults, when you look at particularly older adults, 4 more supplements per day. And of course, some of the implications for that in healthcare are the interactions with medications, how, in nutrition, another thing, and Hannah can appreciate this, when people say, well, is this bad for you? Or is this good for you? Or should I do this? The answer is always, it depends. It depends. Like supplements depends. It depends on their health status, their needs, their baseline diet. It's not something that you can just say, take this, take that. And so, it's even for people that keep up in the supplement area, again, it's another one that's frequently changing. When you look at what people are using in terms of supplements, it varies by age groups. Number one, across all age groups are multivitamins. But then you also see vitamin D, omega-3 or fish oil, calcium. In the older age group, you see B12 here. So, and the reasons people take supplements vary too by age group and by sex. Women, oftentimes for bone health and for other reasons, whereas males, it's like for energy or for, and a lot of now too, people are taking them for immunity and also hoping that in terms of longevity and brain health too. So, there's all kinds of reasons people are turning to supplements and turning to and responding to some of the advertisements. So, we already mentioned that people are using supplements abundantly, and it's not always something that people will say unless you specifically ask. They don't think of them as medications, but, maintenance of health, boosting energy are certainly some of the reasons, and some of this. And even if there's a government funded study denounced supplements, many people still choose to take them. So, it's an interesting thing to follow. It's also interesting that likely the people that need supplements the most are the ones that are least likely to take them. And the ones that are taking supplements are oftentimes the ones that might not need them. If you look at supplement users, they tend to have healthier habits overall. So they're more health conscious. They're willing to pluck down whatever it costs to buy a supplement or to take one regularly. They're more likely to be in good health. And when you look at some of their health parameters, you don't see the elevations of blood pressure. You don't see the elevated BMI. You don't see smoking. So, it's sometimes it's like preaching to the choir that supplement users. And there was recently the proposal that supplements should be covered under SNAP and WIC, but there's huge controversy with that because you have to educate people how to use supplements before you start funding them or allowing them to buy them. They need to know how to use them, what to take, and safety issues too. So it's not that easy. And I think if that ever does get proposed as an actual amendment or bill or whatever, that there's going to be a lot of uproar in terms of that. So I just want to give a little bit about supplements themselves. They were defined in 1994. That's something that's supposed to supplement the diet, taken orally, powders, pills, that is what's considered a dietary supplement. They don't go through the same testing that is medications or drugs do, certainly not anywhere near the stringent approach that you would see. The way the legislation and regulation is now is the manufacturer is responsible for assuring their safety. FDA does not have the manpower or ability to evaluate or monitor all supplements. There's, probably 100,000 on the market. So, that's just not possible. And FDA only pulls them from the market if they have documented adverse effects, which is rare. We've only seen a few actually banned, like ephedra, say 20, 30 years ago, that you rarely see supplements banned. That there's certainly warning lists and ones they're watching, but in terms of actually being banned from the market, it rarely happens. An important term is GRAS. Supplements are considered GRAS substances, which is generally recognized as safe. I think I have a slide on that. Yes. So anything that was on the market in 1994, any type of supplement, multivitamins certainly were, vitamin C certainly was, they were grandfathered in. So the only supplements that are now having to go through a little bit more approval process are newer supplements that are considered new dietary ingredients. But again, it's more the manufacturer supplying that information and, you know, saying they're safe, but it's not clinical trials. It's not clinical trials. So these generally recognized as safe. The US has a huge list. Food additives are on there. A lot of different things, certain ingredients you would see. Dietary supplements fall on the GRAS list. Does not mean risk-free. It just means, from what we know, they're generally recognized as safe at the level that they're currently being used. So, and I did provide you here with a link to what the GRAS list. Our GRAS list is much longer than many countries around the world. So that just gives another pause to dietary supplements. And again, you know, the act required that supplements be safe, be unadulterated. And you probably see things in the news with, you know, certain toxins and metals and contaminants found in supplements produced with good manufacturing processes. All those kind of things are within the act. The Food Safety Modernization Act did amend a few things and did get FDA a little more authority to act more proactively in the supplement industry. And you did see some of that play out. But again, there's a lot of potential issues. And so FDA doesn't also regulate terms that supplement users love to use, like pure and natural, that those really are meaningless terms legally. And so, you know, just because it says that, consumers oftentimes perceive those as better choices, but it really has little value in terms of actually defining a supplement. And so the FDA is mainly looking at safety. And again, that's only by report. And all these other things are on the shoulders of the manufacturer or the consumer to actually investigate these things. Supplements, some supplements do have these seals of approval, and those are important to look for. This is where the supplement company would voluntarily send their supplements to an independent lab, not FDA, where that lab then evaluates, you know, that it contains what it says on the label. They help determine the expiration date. So these USPC seals, NSF is another one. So some of your more quality supplement manufacturers will include these seals, and that's an important thing for consumers to also look for. And health claims can be on supplements. Not all have them, but and we don't really have time here to talk about health claims, but on supplements, they tend to be what we call structure function claims. The supplement will promote or help. It's not going to say cause or prevent. It's going to have kind of vague terms. And those are easier for supplement, you know, can promote bone health, not prevent osteoporosis. That would not necessarily be allowed. So you have to kind of watch that. May reduce the risk of, so, you know, you're going to, these are what draw consumers into. They can also make more claims on the website than they can make on the bottle. That's more closely regulated. So the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics says ideally meet your needs by food, but that some people may need supplements. And I'm going to skip through this because it's easier on the next slide to see. So there are people that benefit from supplements. And these are people that may have inadequate intake or restricted diets, people that may have altered absorption, increased needs, different variables that may make supplementation more recommended by a health professional. So certainly women and infants and children probably need vitamin D. You just, that's one that I kind of personally feel you don't see a universal recommendation, but I feel most people would benefit from a D supplement. Women, certainly you all as nurses know that childbearing age, the role of folic acid in that supplement in preventing neural tube defects and birth defects. Pregnant women certainly, dependent on their overall diet and their needs, will benefit from iron, folic acid. Vegans, that's a whole nother thing. And when we talk about plant-based diets, the stricter a vegetarian is, the more animal foods they either restrict or completely avoid, the more indication for potential supplementation. You only get B12 through animal foods. So you've got to supplement or choose fortified foods if you're eliminating all animal foods. And there's other nutrients of concern, so to speak, in your patients that are transitioning to a plant-based diet or deciding to become vegan, that there are many nutritional concerns and considerations in that group. Doesn't necessarily, mean they shouldn't. It just means that there's things they need to plan or think about. And, folks that don't consume dairy, there's very few sources of vitamin D in our diet. Fatty fish has some, but milk is not a natural source. It's fortified. Back in the 40s to prevent rickets in certain areas of the country. So, that's a source for many of us. And now we get less through the sun because the abundant use of sunscreens, which is also indicated. And then, adults over 50, I'll show you in a minute, not just B12 and D, but, anybody over 50, if you look at the dietary guidelines, needs certain supplementation. You just with B12, your absorption changes, your body's ability to utilize B12 changes, and the risk of deficiency is much higher. And so just some of these I will go through. I won't read them all, but again, know that while right now we don't recommend supplementation across the board, there's certainly people that benefit. This is
I was just gonna jump in. No, we're about 8 minutes from the top of that.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
This has been phenomenal, and I'm going to lower.
Well, I'm sorry I'm going so fast, but
no, it's
this is what the Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommends for individuals over 50 years of age. Supplementation of B12, calcium, vitamin D, and B6. So that is there, and it gives here the amounts that's recommended. And when I get to it, I'll show you a couple things. These are some excellent websites on dietary supplements that you can trust. You can trust these to get the information and hopefully up to date as they can be. But these are the Office of Dietary Supplements. I'm going to show you that. This is just an example. They provide these vitamin and mineral fact sheets for consumers and for health professionals. And let me just open this real quick because it's just so amazing as a resource for all of us as health professionals. So let me go there. I think this is it. So these are all the fact sheets. So you can check on one. Somebody asked about, where is it? No, it's not there. I'm trying to look. Let's just look at B6. So you see there's consumer, there's one in Spanish, and then the health professional version. And I know it's a lot of reading, but you can also skim. There's the recommended intake, sources, dietary supplements, what our current intake and status is, deficiency, groups at risk for inadequacy, and the list here, the folks that are at risk, links with disease states is there. It also will give you, there's some health risks with excess intake. Interactions with medications can be found here too for your dietary supplements. Which medications, and I know, it's hard to keep up with, but if you do have special concerns, I mean, Hannah and I are dietitians, there ain't no way we know everything about all these supplements. It's just, who can know it all? But having the resources, I think, can help us guide patients and educate ourselves as well. So let me go back here. I will try to hurry, Hannah. The data on multivites isn't strong in terms of benefit. Doesn't mean they're not beneficial or they hurt you, but in terms of reducing disease risk, the evidence is not there. This is a recent study from just March of 22 that a daily multivite compared with placebo did not significantly reduce the incidence of total cancer. It did not also alter cardiovascular disease outcome or all-cause mortality. So if people are looking to multivites to reduce chronic disease, the evidence just isn't there. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a risk. However, this one came out when I was teaching that course, and I'd already talked about supplements. This one came out just literally, it came out in the end of November, but it's just hitting the press and the media. Taking a daily multivite for 3 years is associated with a 60% slowing of cognitive aging. I mean, I am taking my Centrum Silver, So this is a study that just came out, and there's little risk with multivites if you're not using the high potency ones. And I'm going to skip over this. This is things you probably already know, but just to show you this is the difference between, I love personally the designer vitamins, so to speak, the ones that are designed for age groups or for sexes. So here's the Centrum Silver for women. It's going to reflect some of the differences. And that last study used Centrum Silver. You see more B6, you see more B12, you see more vitamin C, you see more calcium, more zinc, a little less iron because they're postmenopausal. They're not losing iron through menstruation. So iron needs drop after menopause. More manganese and chromium. We won't get into all the rationale, but these vitamins are different. And when you look at, for example, the men's, there's no iron in 50 plus because men get iron through their diet and their needs are only 8 milligrams a day. And most men overall, unless they're vegan, are probably getting sufficient iron through their diet. They don't need supplemental iron. And again, just some of the differences too with men. Watch out for high potency, ones that are above the daily value or the RDA. The daily value that you see on food labels is based on the RDA, but it's not life stage or sex specific. It's more of a generic number that's kind of based on all of those. But, since there's little regulation to prevent supplements actually providing more than the UL. And when you combine that with dietary intake and potential use of fortified foods, you can get pretty high and certainly more risk of interaction. I'm going to skip over this. These are a little bit about herbal supplements. Again, those are in that database I showed you. This I pulled together just for this talk. And you're going to find some of this in the supplement fact sheets, but there's some other drug interaction checklists out there that might be helpful. Herb drug interactions, common herbal supplement drug interactions, because that is an issue. So asking your patients, not only medications, of course, but what supplements. This is something that's from the Office of Dietary Supplements. It's an excellent medical form that patients can use and provide, where they document their medicines, their supplements, why they're using it. So of course, this is free to use. And it has a second page with questions they might have or notes. So that's another valuable resource for people to document, and then they can hopefully bring it to an appointment, so that, you know, it's an easy way to communicate and provide a healthcare provider with information about things. So I think we're running out of time, Hannah. I was just going to talk. Yep.
Yeah, this has been phenomenal.
We
Jamie.
may have to just wait till part 2. This was just about, you know, where we get our nutrition info, but whew, we got through a lot. Let me just skip through a few things here real quickly. And I'll touch on some of this again. Of course, this is another good resource. And I know it's from a popular magazine or publication, but I use this every year in education. This is from US News and World Reports. You probably have seen it, the best diets. But, you know, these are all reviewed by dietitians, you know, physicians, scientists, and they look at a variety of diets in relation to their nutritional quality in terms of sustainability, people being able to follow them, not just short-term, but long-term. And they're not all looking at weight loss, but for some, they look at weight loss. It's, you know, how it does in preventing disease, all kinds of variables they're looking at, and they rank them every year. So, you know, if you look, all of these truly are plant forward. I think keto was ranked number 37, you know, in terms of best diet. So these are, and maybe we'll touch more on these, but this is a great resource. And if you go to this website, it gives you a description of the quote diet. I am not an advocate of diets. I truly am not. But I think a plant-based style of eating is a positive way for most people when you look at chronic disease risk and everything. And even weight control, because it tends to be a lower energy density approach. But this is a good resource, I'll say. And I certainly have more here that's more scientific based than this. And somebody's question, and maybe I'll have time to get to that real quick. And then I'll pull some of this in again. Somebody asked about how you talk to your patients about weight. And I give a lecture every year in one of the nurse midwife classes on obesity. And we talk about this, that patients don't want to hear the word obese. That, you know, they respond better to weight or even unhealthy weight, BMI, and thinking about cultural differences. And this gives you some examples of how to ask about eating patterns in non-judgmental ways, because it can be a very delicate conversation. That sun is coming in on me. And using people first. This is a journal article looking at reduction of weight bias and stigma and just how to talk to people. So hopefully these resources could be helpful too. So, well, Hannah, how are we doing on time?
So we're over by 3 minutes, but it is phenomenal. And I think, Jamie, this will kick us off toward an amazing part of part 2 in June. And Anita, I just saw your question. We will include the site to request the PowerPoint next week in an email. Betsy and Sarah and Jamie and I are committed to ensuring you have everything that you need there. And I know Jamie said she would stick around for a few minutes if anybody has any specific questions. And otherwise, we will look forward to seeing you at the June discussion on June 15th at 6 p.m. But most of all, Jamie, my dietitian NP brain is swirling and I have so much to take in, but I can't thank you enough.
I'm sorry.
No, this is the best information. Thinking with both my hats, I'm like, I feel like now I have so many resources from your expertise. I can't wait to share with colleagues and then continue the discussion because it's so thorough. And all of these things come up in clinical practice on an hourly basis, supplements, recommendations, and then especially just that person first language. So I can't thank you enough, and we'll go from there. So feel free to stick around if you have more questions. We'll get back with everybody with the PowerPoint. Happy Nurses Month, and we'll see you in June.
Thanks, Hannah.
All right, thank you all.